March 30th, 1945. 1,400 bombers and 900 long-range fighters of the US 8th Air Force enter German airspace. Their targets are U-boat and oil facilities located around the city of Hamburg. Some 24 ME-262 jet fighters from JG-7 scramble to meet this raid. Diving through the mass offensive fire of the US bombers, ME-262 shoot down 2 B-17s over the town of Lüneburg. Another group of ME-262s attack an American formation over Hamburg, claiming 2 P-51s and another B-17 shot down. In total, some 4 B-17s and 3 P-51s are claimed shot down by German jets on this day, in return for the loss of 3 ME-262s to defensive fire and enemy fighters. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the pilots of JG-7 did well this day, inflicting twice the losses on the 8th Air Force that they themselves had suffered. Or did they? This account, which can be found in the various books about the ME-262, contrasts sharply with contemporary American accounts of the raid. While the various US reports indicate the presence of ME-262s in the combat area, eyewitness and after-action reports instead talk of hesitant and half-hearted attacks on the US bomber formations by the German jets, which ultimately inflicted little damage. Though 6 US bombers and 3 P-51s were lost this day, US missing aircrew reports attribute these losses primarily to flak, though mechanical failure and accidents increase these losses even further. In fact, only 1 US bomber appears to have been shot down by aircraft on this day, but the account from the surviving crew claims it was their own fighter escort. How can such contrary narratives exist about the same event? Is it only the accounts of the air battles on March 30th where such discrepancies exist? Or are there other days where the US and German accounts do not match up? Are these discrepancies evidence of a previous attempt by the US Army Air Force to cover up losses of US bombers to German jet fighters? Or is it that the various books written about the ME-262 simply put too much faith in the claims made by the German jet pilots? And if that's the case, did the ME-262 really shoot down as many aircraft as is often claimed? Or did it perform less effectively than has often been portrayed? In this video, we'll look at the sources, the records, and the challenges in trying to reconcile two nations' accounts of these air battles, and attempt to figure out if the ME-262 really lives up to its reputation. Hi everyone, Woe Kelly here. In this video, I want to discuss the combat history of the ME-262, more specifically what has been written in books about the combat performance of this aircraft. The ME-262 has developed something of a legendary reputation since World War II. It was the first jet fighter to see significant combat service, and it is often claimed the aircraft shot down hundreds of Allied bombers and fighters in the final months of World War II, managing, according to some sources, a 5-to-1 kill ratio. However, when one looks closely at books on the ME-262, it becomes clear that there's been limited cross-referencing of Allied losses against victory claims made by ME-262 pilots. Though comprehensive sources exist that list total Allied losses, there's little available that breaks down these losses by cause. Indeed, the difficulty in determining losses inflicted by ME-262 units caused Manfred Bohm, one of the major writers on the ME-262, to conclude, "In spite of careful research, it will never be possible to determine the exact number of enemy aircraft shot down by jet units." However, this may not be the case, particularly with American losses. Previously archived documentation that now exists online can help us determine what caused the loss of particular aircraft. For this video, I'm going to focus on the air battles between the Allied Air Forces and JG-7, which was the Luftwaffe's largest and most successful jet fighter unit. Almost every engagement between the Luftwaffe jets and Allied aircraft involved JG-7, and has more written about it than almost any other Luftwaffe jet unit. In this video, we'll first look at the air battle on March 30th, 1945 between the 8th Air Force and JG-7, where I can demonstrate my methodology for cross-referencing JG-7's claims against Allied records. Next, we'll check all of JG-7's claims from March and April 1945 against Allied records and see how they compare. Finally, I'll offer some opinions about JG-7, the ME-262, and literature on the jets, which you can agree or disagree with. I wanted to draw attention to these quotes because they encapsulate many of the issues I encountered when researching this video. Books on the ME-262 are filled with accounts of skilled Luftwaffe pilots diving their jets into mass formations of Allied aircraft, seemingly inflicting losses with some impunity due to the speed and firepower of the ME-262. However, contemporary Allied reports do not always agree with these accounts, leading to questions about which sources are reliable and which are not. However, as the final quote from Bohm indicates, at times historians have seemingly put greater faith in the accounts made by JG-7 pilots than divergent Allied accounts where they exist. Is this regard for Luftwaffe accounts warranted, or are the accounts and victory claims from JG-7 pilots less reliable than has often been assumed? Let's take a look at the strengths of the German sources available to historians. This is a sample of a daily report which contains the victory claims made by JG-7 for March 30th, 1945. Every day, combat reports were submitted by a Staffel or group and were transmitted up to the Geschwader, then to the Fliegerkorps Flieger Division, and then finally up to the OKL. Many of these daily reports survived World War II intact and have been used by historians writing about JG-7 to detail the victory claims made by its pilots in the final months of World War II. Specifically here, we have 8 claims made against Allied aircraft on March 30th. Unfortunately, this is the only example I possess of one of these daily reports, so I limit this video to evaluating the claims present in books about JG-7, rather than what JG-7 claimed in these documents. This is because historians have brought in other sources to supplement the daily reports. As noted in the appendix of Colin Heaton and Anne-Marie Lewis's book, The ME-262 Stormbird. Due to a lack of accurate record-keeping later in the war, this claims list is by no means complete. Several pilots scored kills with witnesses that never reached the OKL or OKW in Berlin. A large percentage of German military documents did not survive World War II. Thus, historians have supplemented the daily reports with other sources in an attempt to form a more complete record of ME-262 claims. Heaton and Lewis continue. The sources used for this were Foreman and Harvey, page 369 through 378, and archival material supplied by Arno Aberdoth, the German military archives, and documents supplied by the pilots themselves. Similarly, the introduction to Manfred Bohm's book on JG-7 states, the author was able to meticulously compile all that he had learned in countless discussions with the surviving participants and in documents held by the survivors of those who had died or in the archives. Using the archival evidence and the recollections and personal documents of Luftwaffe veterans, the different historians who have written about JG-7 or the ME-262 have sought to form a more complete picture of how these jet units performed in combat. Unfortunately, a large problem with these kill claims and these sources is that they all amount to unverified claims. Let's go back to the daily report. These numbers represent the initial claims made by JG-7 pilots, but they had not yet been seriously scrutinized by the OKL. The Luftwaffe understood, as did all other nations, the pilots overclaimed how many aircraft they shot down. For a claim to be verified, the final destruction or explosion of an aircraft had to be observed either by a witness or on footage from gun cameras installed in the plane. This process was not quick, and it often took months for a Luftwaffe pilot to receive confirmation of their victory claim. However, the majority of ME-262 sorties occurred during the final weeks of World War II, when the German state was collapsing. As historians Don Caldwell and Richard Muller state in their book, Luftwaffe over Germany, Defense of the Reich, the RLM personnel clerks wrote the claims data in a large ledger in the order in which they were received, and added notes as the process continued. Claim verification ended abruptly in early February 1945, and the original ledgers apparently did not survive the war. They had fortunately been microfilmed in early January 1945, but the microfilm rolls themselves disappeared from public view until the 1990s, when they were made available to researchers in the German archives. This line is important because according to the appendix in Colin Heaton and Anne-Marie Lewis's work, the ME-262 Stormbird, some 80% of total ME-262 claims listed were made between the start of February 1945 and May 8, 1945. The majority of ME-262 claims then fall outside the time period that Luftwaffe claims were still being scrutinized by the OKL, and they should be treated with caution. Similarly, any additional claims present in supplementary sources used by historians, be it interviews with veterans decades after the war, or contemporary personal documents, still are unverified claims, no more reliable than what is present in the daily reports. Both Manfred Bohm and Robert Forsyth acknowledge this problem, and do make attempts to point out cases where JJ7's claims do not match up with Allied losses. This tends to be rare, however, because on most of the days JJ7 flew, Allied losses exceed the number of claims made by JJ7. This may seem at first to indicate that many of JJ7's claims are accurate. However, looking at the total losses can be misleading. During the final months of World War II, Allied aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft guns, mechanical issues, and accidents. Though Allied losses will often exceed JJ7's claims, many of these losses will have been the result of other causes. There are no books or comprehensive sources that break down Allied losses in a way that will help us determine what aircraft were lost to ME-262s, and what was lost to flak, mechanical failure, or accidents. However, there are contemporary documents that can be consulted which will allow us to compile this information. Let's take a look at those sources. In order to check JJ7's claims, we need sources that'll provide us with the number of Allied aircraft lost on these raids. As on March 30th, the principal adversary for JJ7 in March and April 1945 was the United States 8th Air Force. Perhaps the best comprehensive source for 8th Air Force losses is Roger A. Freeman's mammoth book, The Mighty Eighth War Diary. This work is a chronological listing of every 8th Air Force mission in World War II, drawing on many archival documents such as 8th Air Force daily summaries, weekly intelligence summaries, and the individual squadron, group, wing, division, and HQ records. Here's a page for Roger Freeman's book which covers March 30th. We can see the quantity and type of aircraft dispatched, what the targets were, the tonnage of bombs dropped on the target, claims against Luftwaffe aircraft, known losses over enemy territory, known crew casualties, and so on. Further down we have remarks, which specify losses to individual bomber groups, plus additional operational losses during the raid. Unfortunately, there are no specifics on what caused the losses of these aircraft. However, the information in this book can help us utilize another resource at will, a resource that at first glance may not appear to be suited to this task: the U.S. Army Air Force Missing Aircrew Report. The Army Air Force recommended in May 1943 the adoption of a special form, the Missing Aircrew Report, devised primarily to record the salient facts of the last known circumstances regarding missing aircrews. The MACR would also provide a means of integrating current data with information obtained later from other sources in an effort to conclusively determine the fate of missing personnel. From June 11, 1943 through to VG Day, the War Department required that a missing aircrew report be filed within 48 hours of the time an Army Air Force's plane and occupants was officially declared destroyed or missing in action. The commanding officer from the last station from which an Army aircraft departed determined its loss, reported it by radio to the Adjutant General. As soon as possible thereafter, a written MACR containing the same information as the oral report was to be sent. Reports were often sent in batches of as many as 25 by the preparing unit. Though designed for the purposes of determining the fate of missing aircrew, these reports also contain considerable amounts of information related to the aircraft these men last flew in. Here's the first page of an American missing aircrew report for B-17448746. We have the squadron that this aircraft was assigned to, what group the squadron belonged to, where the aircraft was based at, the date this aircraft was lost, and what the bomber's target was on the day it went missing. However, it's the next few pages that are crucial for our purpose. The AC suffered a direct hit in the forward part of the plane, which blew the nose off. It was hit at 15:36 hours over Wittenberg. A nearby aircraft reported that, although it appeared to be under control, everything forward from the ball turret seems to have been wiped out. It was last seen at about 4,000 feet, heading 360 degrees after losing altitude in a series of turns. As many as 5 shoots were seen. This is a summary of eyewitness accounts crew members from other bombers that witnessed the demise of B-17448746 gave. Further interviews after World War II of surviving crew members from 448746, present later in the report, confirmed that this aircraft was lost to flak. These eyewitness accounts are present on most missing aircrew reports, providing us a means to determine what caused the loss of these aircraft. When combined with the MACR index, and digital copies of these reports available online, it becomes feasible to determine what caused the loss of all US aircraft on these bombing raids. However, utilizing MACRs as a research tool for US aircraft losses do have some limitations. As the name would imply, a missing aircrew report is concerned primarily with missing aircrew. Aircraft that explode while making an emergency landing at their base, aircraft which crash land in friendly territory, even aircraft which crash in enemy territory but whose crews return to Allied lines. These aircraft losses do not have reports, nor will they appear in the index. Even losses that seemingly deserve an MACR occasionally do not have one written. For example, Lieutenant Evergard Wagner of the 339th Fighter Group was one of 4 P-51s lost over enemy territory on March 30th, 1945. He is also the only one of the 4 combat losses that does not have a missing aircrew report, and there seems to be no discernible reason why this is the case. Fortunately, after cross-referencing the MACR index with Roger Freeman's book, and US intelligence reports detailed later, I only found 4 other cases of 8th Air Force losses that were missing MACRs on the days I examined. This means the majority of US combat losses do have missing aircrew reports, and with them, eyewitness accounts of what caused the demise of these aircraft. Another major source that can be utilized are US Army Air Force daily intelligence reports, which I cited earlier. These reports are not adequate for breaking down losses, but these reports contain useful details on enemy air opposition and their tactics. These contemporary combat narratives gives us an American perspective, which can be contrasted against the accounts from JG-7 pilots present in books. Additionally, websites such as Little Friends, Forgotten Props, B-17FlyingFortress.de, the American Air Museum in England, 8th Air Force Historical Society, and various bomber and fighter group websites were all used to various degrees to help fill in gaps or allow for additional cross-referencing of US losses. Bringing all these sources together, let's see what happened on March 30th and see how it stacks up against the accounts present in books on JG-7. March 30th, 1945. 37 bomber groups and 15 fighter groups of the United States 8th Air Force are dispatched to attack U-boat-related targets in northern Germany. The B-17s and P-51s of the 1st Air Division target U-boat yards and rail bridges in Bremen, while the B-24s and escorts from the 2nd Air Division hit the U-boat works at Wilhelmshaven. The biggest force, comprised of the B-17s and P-51s of the 3rd Air Division, target U-boat yards, dock facilities, and oil refineries in Hamburg. Against this overwhelming force, JG-7 has less than 40 operational jets on hand. At 1300 hours, all operational jets are scrambled to intercept the inbound American bombers. 6 jets suffer mechanical failures which keep them grounded. 12 ME-262s from 1st Group JG-7 are given the incorrect heading by the ground controller and fail to make contact with the bombers before they run low on fuel. 19 ME-262s from 1st Group and 3rd Group JG-7 make contact with US aircraft around Hamburg. First in are the jets of 9 and 10 squadrons of 3rd Group, which attack US bombers north of Lüneburg. Lieutenant Schnorrer claims the destruction of 2 B-17s, and his wingman, Victor Peterman, claims a probable on a B-17. Lieutenant Schnorrer is then hit by defensive fire from the bombers and is chased to the ground by the escorting P-51s. He successfully bails out of his damaged aircraft, but his legs strike the tail of the jet, badly injuring him and preventing him from flying for the remainder of the war. Next to attack are the jets of 1st Group of JG-7. Major Rudoffer claims 2 fighters, while Private Heem claims another P-51 and Private Rear claims a B-17. Sergeant Jansen from 1st Group JG-7 is hit by US fire and bails out of his aircraft as flames reach the cockpit. Sergeant Guy Teufel of JG-7 attacks a lone Mosquito operating over Hamburg, but is flying too fast to observe the results. He is immediately set upon by P-51s and flees back to his base, diving into a foxhole just as the Mustangs begin to shoot up the airfield. Lieutenant Schulte from JG-7 took off to provide cover for returning jets, but is caught by roaming P-51s and killed. This is how the day is characterized in literature about JG-7 or the ME-262. However, much of this account is at odds with contemporary US documentation. The US INTOP summary for March 30th does confirm the presence of 30 to 35 ME-262s in the Hamburg area, which launched attacks against the 3rd Air Division. Nonetheless, the INTOPS report also mentions that the aircraft of 1st Air Division over Bremen were attacked by 4 to 5 ME-262s, and the aircraft of 2nd Air Division over Wilhelmshaven report a single ME-262 trailing them. It is unknown what formation these jets belong to. According to American accounts, the US fighter escorts scattered most of the ME-262s, and the only organized resistance spotted was one formation of 8 jets flying in line abreast formation. Of the ME-262s which penetrated the bomber formation, it was claimed by bomber crews that some of the jets flew through the formation without firing their weapons. The gunners on the B-17 stated that the jets were flying faster than usual and were difficult to track with their turrets. Over Hamburg specifically, the bombers of the 3rd Air Division claimed 6 to 8 ME-262s made several passes at them in the target area, coming in from 6 o'clock either singularly or in pairs between 13:28 hours and 13:40 hours. The bomber gunners claimed 0, 1, and 3 on the ME-262s, that being 0 kills, 1 probable kill, and 3 damaged. The 304 P-51 fighters of the 3rd Air Division record engaging 12 to 15 ME-262s which were trying to attack the bombers over Hamburg. 4, 0, and 7 jets were claimed, 4 destroyed, 0 probable, and 7 damaged. 1 P-51 is shot down by attacking ME-262s. Over Bremen, the 1st Air Division claimed 4 to 5 ME-262s made a couple of passes at the bombers. The 287 P-51s escorting the 2nd Air Division claimed 2, 0, and 1 against the ME-262s, including one that crashed after it ran out of fuel, northwest of Magdeburg. The bombers make no claims on ME-262s, and the reports from the bomber groups mention that the jets only attack straggling US bombers. The 2nd Air Division mentions no attacks over Wilhelmshaven by the lone ME-262. No claims are made by fighters or bombers. The 3rd Air Division was the formation most likely attacked by JG-7. Against claims made in books of 5 bombers and 3 fighters shot down, the 3rd Air Division had losses of 3 bombers and 3 fighters this day, of which we have MACRs for 3 bombers and 1 fighter. From the 493rd Bomber Group, B-17 4339226 was shot down by flak. B-17 4338311 was also shot down by flak. From the 486th Bomber Group, B-17 4338142 was shot down by flak. From the 357th Fighter Group, P-51 4472328 was lost to mechanical failure. The 2 other losses from this formation do not have MACRs, however other sources account for these losses. From the 353rd Fighter Group, P-51 4472328 crashed in England. From the 339th Fighter Group, P-51 4472065, piloted by Lieutenant Evergard Wagner, was shot down by an ME-262. This is supported by the INTOPS report, which mentions 1 fighter lost to a hit-and-run attack by ME-262s. The 1st Air Division over Bremen, which reported attacks by ME-262s, but which was some 100 kilometers away from where JG-7 is stated to have been, lost 3 B-17s and 1 P-51. From the 303rd Bomber Group, B-17 448484, was damaged by flak and forced to crash land on the continent. From the 351st Bomber Group, one B-17 crash landed on the continent and was written off as uneconomical to repair. From the 352nd Fighter Group, P-51 4414882 was lost to mechanical failure. The only potential loss to ME-262s was B-17 42102-590 from the 381st Bomber Group. Surviving crew members claimed they were shot down by friendly P-51s after falling out of formation due to damage from flak. There is some evidence to suggest that the gunners misidentified ME-262s as P-51s. For starters, the number of P-51s mentioned in the gunner's account corresponds to the number of ME-262s listed as being over Bremen on this day. The gunner states the P-51s were flying in normal P-51 formation, while a page from the 339th Combat Chronicle states that the ME-262s over Bremen were flying in an American-style formation. The silhouette of both aircraft is relatively similar, especially when the P-51s are carrying drop tanks under their wings. Finally, the fact that P-51s would accidentally shoot down one of their own bombers is hard to believe, especially since the Germans flew no 4-engine bomber types by this point in the war. However, the description of American markings on the nose of the plane, black and white checkered, is hard to reconcile since there's no evidence ME-262s were painted in such a way. There's also no evidence that JG-7 was over Bremen this day, as all books have them 100 kilometers away around Hamburg. The only loss for the 2nd Air Division was B-24 42110155 of the 491st Bomb Group. This aircraft suffered a mechanical failure that caused it to ditch in the English Channel. As for the Mosquito claim, Forsyth states in his book that there were no RAF losses for the Mosquitoes this day, but the Mosquito attack would have likely have been from the United States Army Air Force. The US Army Air Force used limited numbers of Lend-Lease Mosquitoes during World War II, often Canadian-made. These performed reconnaissance duties, meteorological flights, and chaff dispensing duties for the bomber formations. 3 Mosquitoes were assigned to the 2nd and 3rd Air Division to drop chaff, but the INTOPS report cites no losses, and the only MACR for US Army Air Force Mosquitoes was in the Mediterranean Theater of Operations. Based off the INTOPS reports, the detailed eyewitness reports on the demise of all aircraft via the MACRs, and the losses listed in literature, it becomes very hard to accept the claims made by JG-7 on this day, especially when we know that these claims were no longer vetted by the OKL. It seems that the US narrative rejected by Manfred Bohm in his book is far closer to the reality of what happened on March 30th than what Luftwaffe sources and testimonies from JG-7 veterans state. The large number of claims made by US fighters, compared to the low number of claims made by US gunners, supports the INTOPS narrative that US fighter escorts successfully intercepted JG-7 and prevented them from launching successful attacks on the US bombers. Now, is there any reason to doubt the credibility of the US reports? After having read through 2 months worth of MACRs and INTOPS reports, I have to say that I do not believe so. Both MACRs and INTOPS reports were classified documents, so any propaganda or morale value in downplaying the effectiveness of German jets would be minimal, as the public would not be seeing these documents. And both types of reports have a purpose. MACRs to devise the fate of missing air crews, and INTOPS reports to help 8th Air Force commanders plan future raids and minimize their own losses. Both these reports' functions would be impaired if the reports were lying to their readers. Quite to the contrary, a number of INTOPS reports credit Luftwaffe pilots with making skillful and aggressive attacks on US formations, and many MACRs have clear descriptions of US aircraft being shot down by jets. It doesn't make a lot of sense for these reports to downplay losses to Luftwaffe jets on some days and then show them on others. With these documents, it's my assertion that, contrary to what Bohm states in his book, that historians can determine with some precision what German jets did and did not shoot down. So what happens when we apply this methodology to other days when JG-7 flew? Will we find that March 30th was an exception, a particularly bad day for verifying JG-7's claims against US losses? Or was overclaiming by JG-7 a far bigger issue than has previously been acknowledged? Let's compare JG-7's claims for the other days in March and April 1945. against the US MACRs and INTOPS reports. JG7 officially came into existence in November 1944, created from the remnants of Commando Novotny and the disbanded bomber unit KG-1. However, it was not until March 1945 that JG7 had enough trained aircrew and aircraft to launch large-scale attacks against Allied formations. Some 80% of its wartime claims were made in March and April 1945, so I've decided to focus on verifying the claims in those 2 months. This video does not examine May 1945, as what little remained of JG7 by that point was fighting the Red Air Force, for which I have no sources. Here I've tallied up JG7's claims for March and April 1945, based on the claims from Manfred Bohm's book. Different books have somewhat different numbers, but they are all broadly similar, and for simplicity's sake I chose to stick with Bohm's tally. I've chosen to filter out probable claims made by JG7 where possible. Against these claims, I've cross-referenced the MACRs and Index, the INTOPS reports, Roger Freeman's book, and other sources to narrow down actual US losses to a range I believe reflect what JG7 actually shot down in March and April 1945. Before I share my results, there are some qualifiers I need to explain beforehand which affect these numbers. JG7 engaged RAF Bomber Command and the US 15th Air Force on a handful of days in March and April 1945, but the sources I have for them are not as thorough as those for the 8th Air Force. The 15th Air Force does not have an equivalent to Roger Freeman's book, which I found, so I had to rely exclusively on the daily losses present in the MACR Index, which, as shown previously, is not completely reliable. For Bomber Command, there are sources that give daily losses, but they do not break down these losses by cause. Therefore, there is still some uncertainty about losses caused by JG7 compared to flak or mechanical failure. Regarding missing aircrew reports, on some days eyewitness testimony will describe lost bombers as having been shot down by enemy fighters. Therefore, it is not always possible to tell what type of aircraft shot down the US bomber in question, because on some days both Luftwaffe jets and piston engine fighters flew. This leads to some uncertainty about what caused the loss at times. Other times, missing aircrew reports do specify jets or ME-262s as the cause of the loss, but it is not clear if these were jets of JG7 or other Luftwaffe jet units that were active on days that JG7 flew. Other ME-262 units, such as KGJ-54, JV-44, and EJG-2, also flew in March and April 1945, and on some days their claims overlap with JG7's claims against US aircraft. As well, the ME-163s of JG-400 were active on some days JG7 saw combat. This means that when an MACR states a bomber was lost to an ME-262 or jets, the loss could have been to aircraft of a different unit than JG7. Finally, while US bombers often have detailed eyewitness accounts describing how they were shot down, the cause of US fighter losses can be more difficult to determine at times. US bombers flew in tight formations, so multiple crews would witness the loss of a bomber. US fighters would often get split up during combat, and at times no one would see what became of their wingman who never returned to base. However, most reports do have enough detail to make an educated guess on the matter. As a result of these issues, I decided to create a low estimate and a high estimate of what JG7 likely shot down. The low estimate only includes losses where MACRs indicate aircraft were lost to ME-262s or jets. This helps eliminate any unknown losses that might have been to conventional Luftwaffe fighters or flak. However, a downside is that it almost certainly misses some losses to JG7 where the MACRs refer to ME-262s as enemy fighters. On the other hand, since other ME-262 units flew on days JG7 flew, and I don't have enough information to determine what formation the ME-262s that shot down the US aircraft were from, this estimate will inflate JG7's total somewhat. RAF Bomber Command losses are also included as long as secondary sources state the aircraft was lost to ME-262s. In the high estimate, I include all unknown losses or losses to enemy fighters on the days when JG7 flew. This includes all Bomber Command losses on days ME-262s flew. This number most likely includes losses not to ME-262s, be it accidents or flak or conventional Luftwaffe fighters. It also includes losses caused by units other than JG7. This number is most certainly too high and represents the extreme upper limit of what JG7 could possibly have shot down, according to my research. I've also included my own estimate for what JG7 shot down based off my reading of the documents in front of me. JG7 made 45 claims between November 1944 and March 1st, 1945, representing less than 20% of its wartime's claims against Western Allied aircraft. These were not examined for this video. March 1945 represents the peak effectiveness of JG7. 134 claims, representing 54% of its total wartime claims, were made across 400 combat sorties over a 19-day period, mostly between March 14th and March 31st. 79 claims were made against B-17 bombers. 14 claims were made against B-24s. 20 claims were made against P-51s or reconnaissance versions. 2 claims were made against P-47s. 18 claims were made against RAF aircraft. 1 claim was made against a P-38 or reconnaissance version. According to my research, actual Allied losses to Luftwaffe jets on these 19 days appear to be between 42 to 60 aircraft. Those are 26 to 32 B-17s, 7 to 8 B-24s, 3 to 8 P-51s or variants, 0 P-47s, 6 to 11 RAF aircraft, and 1 P-38 or variant. JG7's losses during this time was 33 to 40 jets. 3 were lost to mechanical failures during missions, 4 were lost in accidents during missions, 7 were shot down by defensive fire from US bombers, 11 were shot down by US fighters, 8 were shot down by either US fighters or US gunners. Additional losses have no information regarding their cause. As well, ME-262s from JG7 were destroyed on the ground by Allied aircraft, but these were not included in the tally above as they were stationary targets with no pilots. April 1945 saw the decline of JG7, as the 8th Air Force directly targeted Luftwaffe jet bases in order to destroy this threat. 68 claims, some 28% of its wartime's total, are listed over 11 days of combat, mostly between April 1st and April 10th. 40 claims were made against B-17s, 2 claims against B-24s, 13 claims against P-51s, 5 claims against P-47s, 2 claims against P-38s, and 6 claims against RAF aircraft. Actual US losses to Luftwaffe jets on these 11 days appear to be between 24 to 34 aircraft. 15 to 19 B-17s, 6 to 7 B-24s, the high number of these because books on JG7 incorrectly identify B-17s as having been attacked by jets when it was B-24s, 0 to 3 P-51s, 0 P-47s, 1 to 2 P-38s, 2 to 3 RAF aircraft. During this time, JG7 lost between 24 to 48 jets. Numbers are somewhat unclear. 12 were lost to US fighters, 10 were lost to either US fighters or US gunners. The remaining jets that were lost were destroyed to unknown causes. For March and April combined, of the 202 aircraft that JG7 claimed to have shot down, my research supports the loss of 66 to 94 Allied aircraft to ME-262 fighters on the days in question, in return for the loss of 57 to 88 jets. I want to emphasize that some of these aircraft were likely shot down by other ME-262 units, which occasionally engaged Allied bombers alongside JG7. My own personal estimate for JG7's claims, after removing losses I believed were caused by conventional Luftwaffe fighters and flak, and subtracting losses I think were caused by other ME-262 units, is that JG7 shot down about 70 aircraft. That's 41 B-17s, 12 B-24s, 5 P-51s, 0 P-47s, 1 P-38, and 10 RAF aircraft, mostly bombers. That would indicate only about 35% of the aircraft JG7 has claimed to have shot down in air battles were actually shot down during these air battles. Though the accuracy rate may sound rather bad, it actually makes sense with some context. Donald Caldwell and Richard Muller's book, Luftwaffe over Germany, Defense of the Reich, demonstrates that Luftwaffe pilots consistently submitted heavily inflated destruction claims against US bombers during the air war over Germany from 1942 to 1945. Some notable late war examples by conventional Luftwaffe fighters include September 11th, 1944, where 51 US bombers were claimed destroyed against actual losses of 26 US bombers to all causes, which includes flak and mechanical failures and accidents. On November 26, 90 US bombers were claimed destroyed against actual losses of 34 bombers to all causes. On December 2nd, 25 US bombers were claimed destroyed against actual losses of 11 US bombers to all causes. And on January 14th, 1945, 28 US bombers were claimed destroyed against 7 US bomber losses to all causes. Given this context, JG7's overclaiming is not all that unusual, and demonstrates why the Luftwaffe put its pilots' claims through a verification system in order to bring them down to more realistic levels. As the system was no longer functional in March and April 1945, the level of overclaim by JG7 was never properly identified. However, there are other issues with JG7's claims listed in books that compound the problems I discovered while researching this video. Of the 31 days in March and April 1945 that books on JG7 show them engaging in combat, fully 12 days have not one single matching Allied loss that I could find. The total number of claims on these days are not large. Only about 39 of JG7's 202 claims fall on these days, less than 20%. Nonetheless, this is a large discrepancy between the claims made by JG7 pilots in books and what US documents show. As I mentioned, this video is about the claims present in books on JG7, not necessarily what JG7 pilots actually claimed at the time. As mentioned earlier, historians have supplemented the Luftwaffe documents with claims made in other sources, be it pilot logbooks, interviews with veterans, or documents held by the families of deceased pilots. Unfortunately, it appears this may have led to accounts of engagements between JG7 and the Allied Air Forces being present in books which never actually occurred. Let's look at March 15th, for example. Manfred Bohm's book briefly details the interception of US aircraft by JG7, which resulted in claims against 4 US bombers. 2 B-24s were claimed by Erich Muller, 1 B-17 claimed by Flight Cadet Pfeiffer, and 1 B-17 claimed by Flight Cadet Windich. Heaton and Lewis list 5 bombers lost in their appendix, however Forsyth doesn't mention this battle in his book on JG7. 9 US bombers were lost this day, however none of the MACRs specify losses to ME262 attacks. The US INTOPS report for this day also contradicts the Luftwaffe account. Some 20 Jet AC were sighted over northwest Germany. These made no attempts to attack, and it seems probable they were engaged on tactical and reconnaissance activity. None of the bomber group mission reports I was able to access mention any attacks by jets this day. There are no claims by US gunners or fighters against ME-262s, suggesting no combat occurred. And as shown, no MACRs on record show losses to ME-262s. On March 17th, Bohm states JG7 shot down 4 B-17s of the 8th Air Force, 2 by Sergeant Koster, and 1 each by Lieutenant Wagman and Sergeant Goebel. These claims are present in Heaton and Lewis's book, but Forsyth again doesn't mention this engagement in his book. 5 US bombers were lost this day, but none to ME-262s. The INTOPS report states the following. The German Air Force put up no opposition, and sightings only totaled 4 jet aircraft. When chased later, enemy aircraft rolled over and dived into the undercast. No bombers report attacks by jets, and once again no claims were made by bombers or fighters, indicating little to no combat. On March 28th, Bowman Forsyth states JG7 shot down 3 US aircraft of the 8th Air Force, a B-17 and P-51 by Lieutenant Stell, and a P-51 by Lieutenant Schuck, for his 201st victory. Heaton and Lewis list these claims in their appendix as well. The 8th Air Force lost 2 bombers this day. The US INTOPS report states, only the fighters sighted any enemy aircraft. 2 jets were observed on an easterly course at 25,000 feet in the Gok area. and another at 11:15 hours near Mulhausen at 24,000 feet. Once again, no fighter or bomber claims against enemy aircraft are made, suggesting no combat. Interestingly, Walter Schuck's memoir, Luftwaffe Eagle, from ME-109 to ME-262, does not mention him flying on March 28th, nor does he claim any kills that day. Even on days where JG-7 did engage US aircraft, many of the accounts made by JG-7 pilots of what happened are at odds with US sources. For example, both Bowman Forsyth references a combat on March 3rd. Oberfährmann Russell damaged the 4th B-17. The American bomber was unable to keep up with the others and dropped out of formation. Following a wide turn, Russell prepared to administer the coup de grace to the stricken bomber, but the explosive rounds from his Mark 108 did not strike the B-17. Just as Russell opened fire, a P-47 of the fighter escort flew right through the hail of cannon fire and exploded like a bursting shell. The problem is that not only were there no 8th Air Force P-47s lost on this day, but the 56th Fighter Group, the only remaining P-47 equipped unit in the 8th Air Force, did not even take part in this raid. JG-7 claimed 2 P-47s and 1 P-51 this day, but none of the MACRs for the 8 P-51s lost this day support these claims, with all aircraft being lost to mechanical problems or being lost while strafing ground targets. In another case, Boehm interviews JG-7 veteran Alfred Ames in 1981, who recounted an engagement on March 21, 1945. According to Ames, "I had the last B-17 full in my sights when I loosed off a short burst. The B-17 exploded in a tremendous fireball and ripped apart 2 other Boeings flying in the immediate vicinity. Lieutenant Weber was unable to take evasive action and flew straight into the fireball. I watched as Giefing shot down 2 Boeings, one right after the other." Eyewitness testimony from the MACRs for the bombers lost this day does not support the claim that an exploding B-17 took down 2 friendly bombers. Only one US bomber unit suffered multiple losses this day, the 490th Bomber Group, which lost 3 bombers to ME-262 attacks. However, the MACR suggests quite the opposite of Ames' account, that it was Lieutenant Weber who collided with B-17 4338972, causing the explosion that Ames saw. The US INTOPS report also agrees with this, mentioning that one ME-262 may have collided with a US bomber. The remaining 2 B-17s lost from the 490th Bomber Group were taken out by gunfire, likely from Giefing, who was also mentioned in the account. JG-7 claimed 13 bombers this day, but 8th Air Force lost 7 bombers, 3 to flak and 4 to jet attack. In yet another case, Forsyth references an account by JG-7 pilot Walter Hagenau, who recalls shooting down 2 P-51s on April 10th with R-4M rockets at an altitude of 5,000 to 6,000 meters. "I rapidly closed in on them from behind, but at a range of about 500 meters the Mustang later started rocking his wings and I knew I had been seen. I loosed off all 24 of the R-4M rockets under my wings straight at the enemy fighters. I was very lucky. I hit 2 of them and they went down out of control. This time I had plenty of speed and had little trouble in avoiding the fire from their companions." There is little evidence in the MACRs to support this. All 9 P-51s lost by the 8th Air Force this day were lost to mechanical issues or were lost at low altitude while strafing German airfields. As Hagenau's account of aerial combat occurred at 5,000 to 6,000 meters, against the formation of several fighters, it is extremely unlikely the P-51s lost while strafing airfields at ground levels were his victims. Since the account states Hagenau attacked a formation of US fighters, these losses would have been witnessed by their wingmen, and the losses would have MACRs to support this. There are more examples of this disparity between US sources and Luftwaffe accounts that could be brought up. For example, the accounts of R-4M rocket attacks on US bombers on March 18th by JG-7 are very difficult to square with US accounts. But the point should be clear. Not only are the number of victory claims made by JG-7 against Allied aircraft often unsupported by contemporary US documentation, but even parts or the entirety of first-hand accounts of these aerial battles can be impossible to corroborate against US records. When combined with the fact that Luftwaffe had stopped vetting their kill claims by the time JG-7 began operations, and the demonstrable occurrence of Luftwaffe pilots overclaiming the number of bombers they shot down during this time period, then there is strong evidence to suggest the claims made by JG-7 and the claims present in books on JG-7 and the ME-262 are heavily inflated compared to the actual numbers of aircraft these units shot down. Given these claims have heavily influenced how JG7 and the ME-262 are seen to have performed against the Allied air forces in the final months of World War II, this is a rather startling conclusion to make. With that evidence in mind, what can we infer about the combat performance of the ME-262 in World War II? Before I wrap things up, I want to quickly touch on something that's worried me while making this video, and that is that this video will come off as being unfairly critical of historians Manfred Bohm or Robert Forsyth or Colin Heaton and Anne-Marie Lewis. This video may create the impression these historians had done a bad job fact-checking JG7's claims against Allied loss records, but that would be unfair to them. Many of the post-war works on the ME-262 contain hugely inflated kill tallies supposedly made by ME-262 units. For example, the 1970s era book Hitler's Jet Plane, the ME-26 Story by Mano Ziegler, has ME-262s on some days shooting down almost double the number of Allied aircraft lost to all causes. Similarly, a book published in 1967 by Aero Publishers Incorporated, which my father purchased when he was younger, also includes massively inflated claims for the ME-262. Bohm used several sources to cross-reference US losses with, including Roger Freeman's then recently published book on the 8th Air Force, which allowed him to scale down JG7's claims to more realistic levels. Similarly, Robert Forsyth refined things further by incorporating US Army Air Force weekly intelligence summaries and RAF sources to reduce JG7's claims even further. Bohm and Forsyth didn't just accept ME-262 claims uncritically, and they used what resources they had available to fact-check what they could. Unfortunately, without any sources that gave a detailed breakdown of what caused losses, they were left with the daily total Allied losses and the claims made by ME-262 pilots, which were often smaller than the Allied losses those days, so on the surface, Luftwaffe claims seemed viable. Also, there was more to these authors' books than just kills. Bohm especially pieced together much of the history of JG7 and the development story of the ME-262, using the interviews he collected and the primary source documents he had. Bohm made several novel arguments in his book, including that engine development problems, and not Hitler's insistence that the ME-262 be a bomber, is what really delayed the ME-262 from entering service sooner than it did. So there's more to these books than just a number of claims they list for JG7. The written history of a topic often goes through constant refinement as new interpretations and new sources are produced and debated, and this video is just my contribution to that process. It's entirely possible my conclusions in this video are wrong, that my use of MACRs to fact-check Luftwaffe claims are unsound, and that Bohm and Forsyth got things closer to reality than I did. Fortunately for me, Donald Caldwell and Richard Muller's recent book about the Luftwaffe's defense of the Reich campaign also cast doubt on ME-262 kill claims, so I'm pretty confident my research as other historians have picked up on the same issues I noticed with ME-262 claims. Nonetheless, this video would have been impossible to complete without the huge amount of work done by people like Bohm or Forsyth or those who came before. Much of this video is owed to the hard work past historians have done on reconstructing the ME-262 story, so it's such a shame that this video will focus on what they might have gone wrong rather than all the stuff they got right. Anyways, with that side of the way, let's get to the actual conclusion. As stated at the beginning of this video, I primarily focused my research on JG7, as it was the preeminent ME-262 unit in terms of number of claims made, the number of jets it fielded, and the number of engagements it took part in. To a large degree, the combat history of JG7 is the combat history of the ME-262, at least when it comes to air-to-air combat. There were other ME-262 units that flew during the final months of World War II, units such as the fighter bomber unit KGJ-54, Adolf Galland's elite JV-44, or the training unit EJG-2. These units, however, saw much less aerial combat than JG-7 did, and thus the total number of kills attributed to these units are much lower. Much like JG-7, however, the claims attributed to these units in books also look to be rather unreliable. For example, on April 17, 1945, JG-7, JV-44, and KGJ-54 attacked the 8th Air Force, claiming 17 B-17s according to Heaton and Lewis. JG-7 claimed 7, while KGJ-54 claimed 9, and one jet from JV-44 accidentally rammed and destroyed one B-17. 8 8th Air Force B-17s were lost this day, of which 2 were lost to ME-262s according to the MACRs. One B-17 was lost when it was rammed by an ME-262, likely the one from JV-44. That leaves one US bomber loss to divide up between 7 claims by JG-7 and 9 claims by KGJ-54. Obviously the math doesn't work, but it illustrates the weakness of both KGJ-54 and JG-7's claims in books, especially in April 1945, where little documentation remains. JV-44 fought primarily against B-26 Marauder formations of the American 9th Tactical Air Force, according to Robert Forsyth's book on the unit. While there are MACRs to support around a dozen B-26 claims, very few of the unit's claims against other types of aircraft can be corroborated, which means most of the 40 to 50 aircraft kills popularly attributed to JV-44 are probably not valid. In summary, only a minority of kills attributed to ME-262 units appear to be valid when checked against Allied records, with obvious repercussions for the total destruction claims often attributed to the ME-262. Much as JG-7 appears to be much less effective than has generally been portrayed, so does it seem the ME-262 was not quite the wonder weapon often supposed by World War II enthusiasts. So how many aircraft was the ME-262 responsible for destroying during the war? Well, very roughly, if we use the claims list in the appendix of Heaton and Lewis's book, which lists about 443 aircraft, and the accuracy rate of JG-7's claims, which is only about 35%, then it could be argued the ME-262 probably did not shoot down much more than 150 aircraft during the war, perhaps even lower given other ME-262 units had even worse accuracy rates. At the same time, ME-262 units suffered a steady flow of casualties, and on the whole tended to lose just as many aircraft as they destroyed during most missions. Overall, the ME-262 seems to have only been able to afflict rough parity and casualties against Allied aircraft in air-to-air combat, and units like KG-J54, which flew ground attack missions, suffered heavy losses as its pilots were often caught at low level by Allied fighters who could dive down on them. When compared to the more enthusiastic depictions of the ME-262, an aircraft at times claimed to have shot down 5 Allied aircraft for every loss it suffered, then these more grounded numbers must appear to be rather shocking. However, when compared against the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe's conventional fighter arm during the same time period, these results appear to make much more sense. Starting in September 1944, the Luftwaffe marshaled its forces in one final effort to bring a halt to the devastating Allied bombing raids against the German synthetic fuel industry. Using pilots mustered from disbanded bomber and transport and reconnaissance units, and thousands of new ME-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s produced in September, the Luftwaffe sought once more to challenge the mass formations of US bombers and fighters flying over Germany. What followed instead was some of the costliest and most lopsided defeats the Luftwaffe would suffer during the war. In just 4 engagements with the 8th Air Force in November 1944, the Luftwaffe suffered losses of over 420 fighters, some 50% of its operational strength, in return for destroying less than 100 US aircraft. Mission losses during the last months of 1944 were routinely reaching 30% of sorties dispatched, and the newly trained replacement pilots arriving to make up losses were severely undertrained. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's conventional fighter force was in a truly hopeless situation, with poorly trained pilots flying poorly manufactured aircraft against the veteran Allied air formations. On January 14, 1945, the 357th Fighter Group set a U.S. Army Air Force record by downing 56 Luftwaffe fighters in a single engagement, while losing only 3 fighters themselves. The Luftwaffe only accepted 2 U.S. bomber raids in strength in January, and lost more than 120 fighters in return for destroying less than 20 American aircraft. Compared against the very lopsided losses suffered by the Luftwaffe's conventional fighters in late 1944 and early 1945, the ability of the ME-262 to inflict even rough parity and casualties in the face of terribly disadvantaged odds speaks to superior performance over both Luftwaffe and Allied fighters then in service. While the ME-262 still had some severe technical flaws when we began to see action, notably related to its engines, it was infinitely more capable than any other aircraft available to the Luftwaffe in 1945. Yet it's also true that many factors worked against the ME-262 putting up more impressive performance during its combat career. So what factors worked against the ME-262 performing better? For starters, the quality of the pilots who flew the ME-262 was not universally high. While some of the best Luftwaffe pilots of World War II flew in the ME-262, many others were the same converted bomber pilots or inadequately trained recruits who made up much of the Luftwaffe's frontline strength in 1945. The limited number of ME-262s and the lack of a 2-seated trainer precluded any real in-depth training for pilots on the ME-262, which often meant pilots had very little experience flying the jet before going into battle. Once in combat, US fighter escorts proved to be a more formidable obstacle to attacking ME-262s than has often been appreciated. While books and online sources often claim the speed of the ME-262, combined with shallow diving tactics against US bombers, would successfully take the jets through the fighter escorts with little risk of interception, this interpretation is rather abstract, as aerial combat is rarely so tidy and straightforward. Luftwaffe tactics stress attacking US bombers in large formations to deliver maximum damage, yet despite JG-7 often dispatching 2 to 3 dozen jets to attack US bombers, there are very few accounts from JG-7 pilots that mention them attacking anything larger than 3 to 4 jet formations. US INTOP summaries demonstrate ME-262 units attempted to make concentrated attacks on US bombers, but often those reports claim these attempts were foiled by US fighters, who intercepted and dispersed the concentrated formations of German jets before they reached the bombers. In general, US INTOP summaries often credit US fighters with successfully preventing attacks by ME-262s on US bombers, which would seem to indicate the ME-262 was not so immune to being intercepted by US fighters as is sometimes claimed. Now, some may argue that US Army Air Force documents will likely overstate the effectiveness of American fighters against the German jets due to bias. However, the INTOPS narrative seems to be backed up by the low percentage of dispatched ME-262s which actually succeeded in shooting down US bombers. It stands to reason that if the ME-262 had such an easy time getting to the US bombers as is often claimed, that this would be reflected in the higher numbers of kills than what ME-262s actually seem to have made. As it was, only about 10% of ME-262 sorties dispatched seemed to have resulted in an actual destroyed Allied aircraft, a rate similar to what the conventional Luftwaffe fighters had managed in early 1944, when they were regularly intercepted by US fighter escorts. Even when US fighters were unable to head off all attacks on the bombers by ME-262s, the escort's constant presence limited the number of attacks pilots of JG-7 could make before they had to withdraw, lest they be boxed in by superior numbers of escorts rushing to the scene. For example, JG-7's attack on the 3rd Air Division on March 30th lasted only 12 minutes before the ME-262s disengaged or were chased off by US fighters. While US fighters had difficulty catching and destroying ME-262s, their ability to thwart attacks by ME-262 units showed they were far from helpless against German jets. The US bombers themselves also appear to have been far more dangerous to engage than is often depicted. Due to the high speed of the ME-262 and the low velocity of the Mark 108 30mm cannons, attacks by ME-262s had to be made exclusively from the rear, where US bombers were the strongest. It's often mentioned that turrets on US bombers had difficulty tracking the fast-flying ME-262s, but that didn't matter that much when ME-262s were forced to make attacks from behind, as the turrets only had to point rearwards and shoot at the oncoming jets. The US 50 caliber machine guns also outranged the lower velocity 30mm cannons on the ME-262, which resulted in ME-262 pilots having to endure several seconds of incoming fire before they could open fire themselves. As a result, ME-262 losses to US gunners were surprisingly high, with at least 20% of JG-7's losses in March being from the defensive fire of US gunners according to Bohm. The high closing speed of the ME-262 and the low velocity guns also offered little time for pilots to aim their guns at the slow-moving Allied bombers. As Captain Eric Brown, who tested the ME-262, stated, "The 30mm cannon was not so accurate beyond 600 meters, so you normally came in at 600 yards and would open fire on your B-17. And your closing speed was still high, and since you had to break away at 200 meters to avoid a collision, you only had 2 seconds firing time. Now in 2 seconds you can't sight. You can fire randomly and hope for the best. If you want to sight and fire, you need to double that time to 4 seconds. This sentiment is echoed by German pilots who flew the ME-262, and while the more experienced ME-262 pilots do seem to have overcome these difficulties somewhat, it's questionable if the inadequately trained recruits or former bomber pilots who made up many of the pilots in ME-262 units did. It's interesting to speculate if the ME-262 pilots on March 30th who flew through the US bomber formation without firing their guns did so because they were unable to line up their sights in the few seconds they had to aim. With only enough ammunition for 9 seconds of firing, ME-262 pilots would naturally be reluctant to open fire on targets they were not confident of hitting, lest they run out of ammunition without shooting anything down. However, this is just a hypothesis of mine. ME-262 pilots do not seem to have any better luck shooting down the faster and more nimble US propeller-driven fighters, though it's difficult to know if this was because ME-262 units actively avoided engaging with US fighters. US INTOPS reports often mention ME-262s refused to engage in combat with US fighter escorts, which makes sense since their priority was shooting down the Allied bombers, who were the ones doing damage to German industries and cities. However, the ME-262 was less maneuverable than Allied fighters, and if Allied pilots were not caught by surprise, they could often dodge attacks by German jets by turning tightly. While literature does state JG-7 shot down around 40 US fighters in March and April 1945, MACR support very few of these claims, with only 5 of the P-51 claims appearing to be valid. US fighter losses in March and April 1945 were overwhelmingly to flak rather than German jets, as US fighter escorts returning to base were ordered to strafe any ground targets or airfields they encountered on the way home, and thus suffered constant losses to ground fire. For whatever reason, ME-262 claims against US fighters appear to be especially unreliable, which is rather troubling given some of the fantastic first-hand accounts and books made by ME-262 pilots of them supposedly downing Allied fighters. In the same period, US fighter escorts shot down at least 23 ME-262s from JG-7 according to Bohm. However, it's likely the majority of the 57 to 88 jets JG-7 lost in March and April were destroyed by US escort fighters. Though it's often asserted that Allied fighters could only shoot down ME-262s when they were taking off or landing, many of the ME-262's JG-7 loss were in fact shot down by Allied fighters at high altitude as they attempted to attack US bombers operating at 25,000 feet. When combined with some of JV-44's losses to US escorts, it becomes clear that ME-262s were far from invulnerable when flying at high altitude or top speed. Overall, JG-7 itself routinely suffered losses of 10% or higher in engagements with US bombers and fighters, losses that were as high as what the Luftwaffe's conventional fighters had suffered in battles against the 8th Air Force in early 1944. As Bohm states, the ME-262 must have seemed like a kind of life insurance. On the other side, there is the fully documented high loss rate, with or without enemy action, which cannot be avoided. At 15%, losses in action among ME-262 units which made contact with the enemy are surprisingly high. In the 8 weeks from the end of February to mid-April 1945, which marked the high point of activities, JG-7 lost 51 pilots killed and 12 badly wounded. This meant that the operational strength of 1.5 group was lost and had to be replaced. This rate is not much lower than that of conventional fighter units with piston-engine aircraft. It seems then that the ME-262 struggled to perform effectively in the operational environment it flew in during 1945, and the results it achieved were far more limited than has often been appreciated. The roughly 45 verifiable aircraft losses that JG-7 inflicted in March 1945, the unit's most successful month, and by far the most successful month of any ME-262 unit that saw service in World War II, are less than some of the heaviest single mission losses the 8th Air Force suffered in 1943 and 1944, losses that it successfully endured. In fact, the arrival of the up-armored and up-gunned Focke-Wulf 190 Sternbach units in mid to late 1944 proved more damaging to US bombers than the arrival of the ME-262 did. Whereas the Sternbach units could and did savage entire US bomber groups with their mass formation attacks, the ME-262 was rarely able to do anything more than inflict a trickle of daily losses on the Allied bombers in the final 2 months of the war. Indeed, in almost every engagement the ME-262 took part in, ground-based flak destroyed more Allied aircraft than the guns or rockets from German jets did. The ME-262 was clearly an advanced design, heralding the future jet age to come, and the Allies were very worried that their use signaled a new jet-based offensive against their bombers. However, Germany was never able to field enough jets to launch truly devastating attacks on the Allied bombers. A new weapon system often needs to be deployed en masse to demonstrate its capabilities, much like the mass use of British tanks at Cambrai in 1917 showed the potential of the tank as a weapon system. The ME-262 was no exception, with JG-7 unable to put up even 50 jets on its best days, and other Luftwaffe units even less than that. The ME-262 was never able to have the impact one would expect of a jet fighter flying against propeller-driven aircraft. The ME-262's limited numbers and the numerical superiority of the Allied forces it was engaging forced ME-262 units to fight something akin to a hit-and-run war against the Allied air forces, launching quick attacks before retreating back to their bases, often chased all the way back by superior numbers of Allied fighters. In such conditions, the ME-262 was never able to really demonstrate its capabilities, and as such its performance was rather lackluster. Yet the mystique of the ME-262, combined with the hugely inflated numbers of kill claims made by ME-262 pilots, and with sometimes questionably accurate first-hand accounts of aerial combat from veterans present in books after the war, all helped to create the post-war legend of a technological super aircraft that allowed skilled Luftwaffe pilots to inflict heavy losses on the numerically superior Allied formations while taking small losses themselves. However, when one looks at the lower number of kills the ME-262 appears to have made, combined with the high losses, it seems a reevaluation of this aircraft may be needed. While the ME-262 was undeniably a very advanced aircraft, it was also an immature design whose features sometimes handicapped its pilot's ability to get the most out of the aircraft. While many of the best pilots in the Luftwaffe flew the ME-262, it was also quite often crewed by inadequately trained crews who could not harness the potential the aircraft had. While the ME-262 was a more advanced aircraft compared to its enemies, the large numbers of piston-engine Allied fighters, crewed by extremely well-trained and aggressive pilots, often offset and nullified the advantages offered by the small numbers of ME-262s and ultimately succeeded in keeping their big friends safe from destruction. By no means is my research infallible, nor would it not benefit from being improved by others with access to more resources than I had, but the results of my use of MACRs to verify Luftwaffe claims does stand up under scrutiny, and it's my hope this video will contribute to advance our understanding of the ME-262, illuminating the challenges faced by those who flew it, and the overlooked success achieved by those who flew their outclassed aircraft against it.